so I'm going to show you guys how I went about replicating or trying to replicate the drum sound on Digital Bath by Deftones. So a few things to point out. Before anyone says it, yes, ideally you need an amazing drummer like Abe Cunningham with a real human groove. I'm using program drums here, so we can forget that for now, but yes, that is ideal. I'm very aware of the different types of drums that Abe Cunningham has used over the years and the drums he used on White Pony, but I'm not going to be trying to seek out those samples. I'm going to be working with my own plugin, Ultimate Heavy Drums, but I'm going to be telling you all the things to listen out for so you can try and replicate these sounds even if you don't have Ultimate Heavy Drums. So the most important thing is Abe usually plays a 14-inch snare that is cranked and tuned quite high, but I don't think he's ever used like a piccolo, which some people might think is a bit of a misconception when they hear a really high pingy snare. But I think the Deftones sound is the sound of a regular kind of 14 by 5 to 6 inch snare that's been cranked and tuned. I'm also aware that he has these like vents on some of his snares. I think it was like Orange County drums made for him. But either way, when I was creating the samples that I'm going to be using, at no point was I thinking, oh, I want to get the exact White Pony or Digital Bath drum sound. But I do like lots of snares with that similar kind of characteristic and vibe in the way they're processed and a similar sound to this. And as soon as I got the plugin back, I think the first thing that I tried as soon as I heard the drums and heard like the vibe of the room at Middleton, I was like, I'm going to see if I can make Digital Bath out of these drums and get as close as I can just using the plugin. And I feel really confident that I got very close in a similar ballpark, in a similar mixing aesthetic to the drums on that record. Again, I'm not using the same types of drums, the same brand, the same sizes, dimensions, all that kind of stuff. But I'm going to tell you what I was looking out for and listening for when trying to replicate that drum sound. So the easiest way to get this drum sound is to open up Ultimate Heavy Drums and just click on the Cyber Bath Tones preset. And this is exactly how it sounds with no processing. And this is the MIDI that I programmed out to try and replicate the vibe and the way Abe's playing. Again, maybe it's not perfect. Maybe, obviously it'd be handy to have Abe Cunningham play in some drums if you want to really replicate that sound, but we're just using these program drums for today. So the snare. In this pack, I'm using the Gretsch Bell Brass high tune snare. Sounds like this. And there's a fair bit of the overhead mic. I say a fair bit, it's up 6 dB, and we're cranking the high end. There's a fair bit of sustain on that snare. So I've brought some of it down using the envelope filter section here so we can listen to that. So that is just the sound of the overhead snare mic. So the envelope filter, it's not doing a lot, but you can tell it's just taking off a little bit of that ring. I think, yeah, the drums at the start of this song are very vibey. You can tell there's a sort of like a big picture element to the sound of the kit in terms of how it's been mixed, as opposed to like a ton of separation. So I get the feeling that you're hearing a lot of like the ghost notes from the overheads and a lot of just the general kit vibe. I think the overheads are capturing a lot of these drums and what you're hearing, and I've brought down the close mic quite a bit. This is how the close mic sounds, and obviously there's a fair bit of reverb on there. So another thing to mention is when I was listening and A-Bing, obviously emulating a room sound is very dependent on the room that your drums were recorded in, and I feel like the drums for White Pony were recorded in that kind of like practice space, kind of like warehouse vibe that Deftones used to have. I remember seeing pictures of them in Kerrang in like 2000 when they're in the studio doing White Pony, and I think that's where the drums were recorded. So Middle Farm is a smaller than a warehouse room, and it's all wood paneling. But I think the main thing I could hear was actually it's a lot of artificial reverb on the mix in this. So I've got the reverb cranked quite high here on all the drums, especially the kick actually, and even on all the cymbals as well. I think the hats in particular, you can hear the reverb on the hi-hats on the record. So that's kind of what we're doing for the snare. And this is the room sound. Sort of using the envelope filter here to tame some of the sustain and release on that. Not doing a lot, but just enough to kind of act more like it's kind of like a gated reverb sound on the room mic. So the kick drum is quite a dull kick sound. A lot of the kicks in this pack are quite metal sounding, quite like a ticky high end, but not a lot of splat. I don't like really like high end above like 10k to be too prominent on my kick drums for metal. So this Guru 20-inch kick, this is how it sounds. This is definitely, out of all the kicks, these two are the most kind of rock sounding, with the least kind of like metallic metal high end. And I've backed some of the high end off on this tilt EQ. So this tilt EQ, that's the high end. That's, sorry, tilting it more towards high end, and that's tilting it more towards low end. And I've turned up the overhead mics. Again, like I said, I feel like the overhead mics are capturing a lot of the kit sound, and the overhead mics get a bit more of a kind of a dull thud. And the room mics. And one thing I noticed, I feel like I could hear, was there was quite a bit of sustain to the kick. I don't know if Abe tends to play with quite a deep kick drum in terms of the dimensions, but I've actually increased some of the sustain on the kick drum. I've only done it on the right kick because I'm only using the right kick here. And that's how the kick sounds. So all of the elements together. Sorry, wrong kick. I may have run out of MIDI there. I need to loop it. Oh, I wasn't playing it. Here we go. So yeah, you can really hear the reverb on the kick, and you can really hear the sustain on the kick. The transient sustain is really adding a lot more of like a doom kind of sound on the kick. It's not like a short, sharp metal kick drum. There's quite a bit of a boom to it. So to recap, the sort of things you want to be listening out for when emulating this kind of drum sound, it's a cranked snare drum, but not necessarily like a piccolo. It's just like your average kind of, I didn't put the dimensions for this one. I guess it's a 14 by 6.5 as well, the bell brass. And then a more of a dull kind of rock metal kick as opposed to a really metal sounding kick drum. I'm using a lot of the overhead mic for the snare, and like the ghost notes coming through the snare I think is really important to the vibe of this. And the like I said, the kick, we're picking up a lot more of the overhead on the kick for this one. In most of the presets you'll see in this library, these overhead mics are all the way down to the bottom. I just never bother with them, but I feel like when I was trying to replicate that kick sound, it really helped having the overheads in there. And again, even though it's quite roomy and vibey, and there is probably an element of room mics in the drum sound, it's quite a tight sound to the drums. So it sort of does have that feeling of artificial reverb on the kit. So I definitely mess around with different reverbs to try and capture like a similar vibe to the reverb they have on the record on this kit. And just for a bit of fun, I'll show you some of these other sounds that I've done to replicate the mix overall. So I'm pretty sure this original sound was me. The easiest way that I try and replicate these kinds of samples and these sounds, I could spend forever just trying to find different synth sounds, or I could just record myself going into a microphone and just mess with it until it gets a bit closer, and I'm pretty sure that's what I did, and it's way quicker than trying to find a synth that sounded like that. It's been distorted, bit of EQ. And I think there's an element of like time stretching that I may have done. It sounds a bit kind of messed with already there as well. And then this sound is just, I think, some Kemper guitar. Just a ton of reverb and delay in front of the amp, and like just doing sort of like pick scraping, pick on the edge of the strings kind of sounds. and trying to emulate whatever pitch I could hear on the record. And then the guitars.